Do you mind? Can you send the recording to me? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right, and then
And I use Canva too, presenting. So it
okay, cool.
usually I
So
just put it in my windows, and then when you go to hit present, like you can just click on the window.
okay, so it looks like I'm gonna pull it up, share.
There you go.
Okay, that work okay?
Yep.
Y'all still see me at all, or just that?
I just see you like in the top boxes, but your primary screen is the presentation.
Okay,
But we
cool,
can see you like in a small little box.
cool. Do you need to see me any more than
Nope.
that? Cool.
Um, all right. I'm going to do a quick little intro and then we can kind of just get rolling on this. I'll keep an eye on anyone coming in and let them into the chat if I have to. Looks like everyone is muted, or I will mute you. All right, everyone. This is Jessie Duppler. She is my PT here in Prescott. Amazing. She is going to kick off our 3-part series on injury prevention. She'll talk about some pathologies on injuries today. And then we have Hillary Osborne, who most of you know, doing a strength presentation in January. And then Dr. Stephanie Munt coming on in February to talk about nutrition and how eating properly or not eating properly could lead to low bone density. So, without further ado, I will pass it to Jessie. And then a reminder, everyone, after Jessie is done, I will keep you here and we'll raffle off some stuff from Janji. All right, Jessie, all yours.
All right, thanks. Do you need me to do any sort of present or anything else, or are we good to go? Okay, I think we're good to go. That's awesome. You guys are having Steph too. She's great. So you guys are going to really enjoy that presentation too. So thanks, Scott, so much for having me. We are going to talk about why we get hurt today. So just like Scott said, I'm a PT here in Prescott. I've been a runner since I was in middle school and a big mountain biker here too. So that's been kind of my background. I do have a PT clinic here. I've also worked prior to going into PT school. I was a bike fitter. And I also worked in surgery. So I have a lot of post-op, and intra-op knowledge that really helps with PT. So we're going to kind of dive right in. If you guys have any questions, I'd love to answer any questions in the end too. This is going to be pretty informal. So we're going to kind of go from there. So the real thing about getting hurt, injuries typically aren't as random as we sometimes think they are. So they can honestly be fairly predictable and preventable if we look at some of the things that contribute to injury. And really, there's one simple equation. Injury equals load more than load tolerance. So whenever we load a system more than the load we can tolerate, that's when we're up for injury. So let's talk about what is load. Load can mean a lot of different things. So there's mechanical load, so ground reaction force. That's the force of how much the ground actually comes back up to you when your foot hits the ground when you're running. Terrain, so rockier terrain gives us different load than, say, the P-vine. Cadence, so the faster we run, different load there than if we're kind of plodding along or slower. There's training load, which you're all familiar with. So mileage, volume, intensity, frequency, all that sort of stuff. And then one aspect of load that we don't necessarily always take into account is lifestyle load. So things like sleep, nutrition, work, stress. That's why I'm really glad you guys are talking to Steph, because that's going to become really important when she talks about some of this stuff. But any sort of load outside of just training load is honestly just as important when it comes to trying to prevent injury. So what I always tell my athletes is load. You only get so many matches in a day, week, month, whatever it is. And once they're used up, those matches are used up. Those matches we get are for everything. They're for training, they're for volume, they're for work, they're for family. And so if you're using a lot of matches, say there's a really stressful thing going on at work, you have less matches for your body to be able to train well. And so that's why it's really important to make sure we're balancing matches appropriately and also taking into account the things that may not cross our mind as quote unquote training load. Because no matter what, whatever system we're loading, we only get so much oomph to be able to do it, whether that's musculoskeletal system or nervous system. So we said injury is when load is over load tolerance. So what is load tolerance? It's the ability of tissue to withstand a force placed upon it. That can be influenced by all sorts of stuff. It can be training history, fatigue, recovery, life stress, like we've talked about, strength, connective tissue health. All these things contribute to making sure that we can feel good on and off the trail. So load can also be different kinds of things. It can be time, so endurance or volume, or it can be intensity, so like force or power. So let's talk about, there's basically 5 variables that build load tolerance. And this is the nice thing about having a coach, right? Like Scott is very familiar with this, Callie's very familiar with this, that we have to manage the load appropriately. And that's what they're really good at. And that's why it's so great to have a coach. But let's talk about these 5 variables and how they interact and how they contribute to injury. So the first one, mobility. The ability to get into positions that running requires. So hip mobility, ankles, big toe extensions are a really big one. So for example, and I'm a big visual aid gal, so I got visual aids. If our ankle is stiff or can't get into what's called dorsiflexion to push ourselves off, or if the big toe can't push us off, what happens is we're still running somehow. So we start to see differences up the chain to compensate for that. A lot of times that can look like the hip working harder or the low back working harder to push us forward, which increases the load through the low back or the hip and can often set us up for injury if the load has to do more, or excuse me, if the hip has to do more work than what it's accustomed to. How I always explain it to my patients is with the lower body, everyone should be doing about 25% of the work. So really generally speaking, 25% hip, 25% quad, 25% hamstring, 25% lower leg and ankle. So if that ankle is not doing its 25%, someone else has to pick up the slack. That's when we start to see an increase in load over what is tolerated. So we got mobility, we got strength. One of my favorite ones to talk about with my athletes. Strength is the capacity of tissues to absorb and produce load. So it's something like 12 times our body weight that goes through our leg when we run, which means we better be pretty dang strong to be able to do that for miles upon miles upon miles. So the muscles need to have the ability to not only shock absorb when foot hits the ground, but then also be able to propel us forward. So then the really important thing from that is our next one, power. If we don't have strength, we can't have power because power is simply strength over time. So how quickly you can generate a force. So running is essentially a single leg hop over and over and over again, which requires power over and over and over again. If, again, we don't have the strength to propel ourselves forward, we definitely can't propel ourselves forward quickly. And then the last one we've got, or excuse me, second to last one is endurance. We need strength and power, and we need the ability to do it for a long period of time. That's where endurance comes in, the capability to maintain effort without fatigue. And when we talk about endurance, we don't just mean aerobic endurance. We mean the ability of the actual bone, muscles, tendons to be able to do their job over and over and over again. So fatigue will change how we run. We've all seen, the shuffle as we get slower and slower and longer into the run, or as we start to slouch as we're getting further and further into the run. All those things change the ask upon the different muscles and can then change how the tissue is getting loaded. Last bit to that, control. That basically takes all 4 and puts them all together. So that's the skill to organize and communicate between all those variables. So a good example is that. Say you're stepping on a rock as you're running downhill. You need the mobility of the ankle to be able to pronate and supinate to avoid just hitting that rock and not going anywhere. You need the power to be able to pop off that rock instead of slowly sinking into it and eventually letting that ankle roll and then getting back up. And typically that kind of stuff, when it happens later down the road, we need the endurance to still have the ability to react without being totally fatigued. So that's how all some of those things work together and why all 5 of those variables are really important when it comes to how we're going to prevent injury. So this is just another way to kind of look at that, right? We've got a teeter-totter here, and we need that teeter-totter to look like this. When we start to see load increasing, volume, intensity, stress at work, whatever it might be, and our load tolerance starts to go down because we don't have the strength to keep up with the volume, or we don't have the mobility, or we just don't have the, like I talked about, the matches, that's when this teeter-totter, when it starts to go in this direction, that's when our tissue starts to become more at risk for injury. So we are going to talk about a couple of examples. I picked a couple that I see a lot in my athletes. So plantar fasciitis, everyone's favorite. So with plantar fasciitis, these are the most common things I see that can precipitate having plantar fasciitis. So a big one is increased volume. So, and again, that doesn't have to just mean in training. It can be increased mileage or it can be things like standing more at work. So again, when we talk about the big lens of how we're going to prevent injury, we have to make sure we're looking outside of just what we're doing on the trail or what we're just doing for training. Another big one is reduced calf strength. The less calf strength we have, the more strain that goes through the plantar fascia at the bottom of the foot to help us actually propel forward. And the last one we talked about a little bit, limited toe, big toe mobility. If we don't have the ability of the big toe to do this action as we're pushing forward, what we see is the heel has to rise a little sooner for us to get up. That increases load again through that plantar fascia as well. So what we see, thickening of that plantar fascia, that's what starts to cause some of that pain that you'll feel. We're doing that to make up for the decreased calf strength, the endurance of the ability to do this time over time over time, and then the ability to springboard past that decreased toe mobility. This also, your plantar fascia is also supposed to be a shock absorber for you, but it's not supposed to be the only shock absorber. So a lot of times if we see strength deficits up the chain, either calf or at hip, we start to see the plantar fascia having to work too hard. And that's when we see increased load and the inability to tolerate that increase in load. Next one, patellar tendinopathy. So same thing, one or more of these conditions might occur. We've got, again, I put increased volume in here because that's a lot of times a culprit. And again, this is why it's so important to have good coaches, because they know how to increase your volume appropriately. So that's why it's fun to talk to people that I know are all getting coached and all have good direction this way. So for patellar tendinopathy, a lot of the other things I see that contribute to it. Decreased hip strength. We talked about how the hip is one of the groups of muscles that helps shock absorb for us. If the hip can't shock absorb, the next joint down is the knee, and it has to shock absorb more for us. Knee is not as good of a shock absorber. So if we don't have the strength for that shock absorption, the knee ends up having to take over. Poor control, so poor hamstring and calf coordination. That requires an increased reliance on the quad, because typically we're all pretty good at using our quads. They're the muscle on the front of our thigh. They can propel us forward forever. But if we have less hamstring and calf coordination, we then ask the quad to still or to start doing everyone else's job. We talked about that 25% for everyone. The quad starts to do 50 and then 75%. And all of a sudden it's like, all right, I'm out. That's as much as I can possibly do. And then also we see sometimes decreased power or decreased fast twitch ability. So the ability of the muscles to actually move us forward quickly. If we don't have ability in the muscle to move us forward quickly, we'll oftentimes ask the tendons to try and take up the slack, because tendons are very stiff. But tendons, again, are supposed to work with muscles. They're not supposed to take over the job for muscles. So if we don't have that power, once again, we start to see an increase in reliance on a tendon, which isn't able to shoulder the load. So result, tendinopathic changes to the patellar tendon, which is accommodating the volume, making up for a lack of hip strength and helping shock absorb more for the knee. Let's see. So good news, we can utilize load tolerance to influence change. We talked a lot about how loading tissue too far past its tolerance, that creates injury. If we underload tissue too far under its tolerance, that creates stagnation. It precipitates no change then. What we really need when it comes to loading tissue to create adaptation is we need that kind of sweet spot to get progress. And again, this is what training is, right? You don't just do a 5K once a week and then expect to go run a 50K at the end of the month. You slowly progress and slowly increase volume. Similarly, you don't run a 50K every day and then expect to feel fresh at your 5K at the end of the month either. So the goal is to be really at the top end of this curve right through here, that appropriate load to improve tissue tolerance. Again, if we have too little load, it's not enough to encourage change, and then too high, and we start to see an increased risk of injury. So we talked enough about stuff that we can't do. Let's talk about stuff that we can do. So actionable steps. Anyone that's worked with me has known how much of a harper I am on strength training for my athletes. Strength training is one of the best things you can do to help improve resiliency, and not only improve resiliency, but also improve performance too. If we talk about those 5 factors, we talked about how we can't have power without strength. So if we don't have strength, we're already missing, essentially taking out 2 of those 5 variables. And one of those variables is the coordination of those things. So technically you're left with 2 basically. So you're left with mobility and endurance and not so much the other 3. That really decreases, like I said, not only performance, but it also sets up your muscles to have to work a lot harder. Again, this one comes back to coaching being very important, slow build in volume or intensity, making sure you're not increasing both at the same time significantly. Sleep and stress. Again, don't ignore lifestyle load. Lifestyle load is very important. You know this because you've had weeks in which you've been really stressed and your run on the weekend has felt like total crap. So we do know there are important factors that look outside of just what's going on the trail or on the road. Nutrition, like I said, I'm really glad you guys are talking to Steph, because that is super, super, super important. Our brain is what's called an obligate glucose user. It cannot use fat. It cannot use protein. So If we are under fueling, we don't have enough glucose in the system. The only way to get it, or the first way to get it, is for us to start to break down muscle to then change it into glucose to feed the brain. So if we're trying to prevent injury and we're under fueling and constantly breaking down our muscle to try and feed the brain, it puts us or it puts us into a pretty bad spot to be able to actually protect that tissue. And again, if we talk about performance, it also really impacts our performance if we don't have enough gas in the tank to go anywhere. So nutrition becomes really important for a whole bunch of things. Last but not least, bone health too. Our bones can get demineralized really quickly. And when it comes to runners, one of the worst injuries we can have is some sort of stress fracture, because that'll typically take us out for the longest. And it's just a real bummer to come back from. So it's really important to have our nutrition dialed in for a bunch of reasons, not just to make sure you get enough calories, but to make sure all the systems are supported. If something hurts, modify it. We typically, as runners, go in two directions. If something hurts, we either ignore it entirely and just keep doing our thing, or if something hurts, we panic and stop doing everything. So what I would love is a little more in the middle there. So I'm always loath to take anything away from people until we can figure out how to modify. That might look like less volume. It might look like less intensity. It may look like cross training more, but there's typically ways that we can still move without having to necessarily stop moving altogether. And that's one of the most important parts. Last thing, track all aspects of training. So when I was training more, I don't anymore now, I'm just doing things for fun, but I used a training journal, and I would put everything in there. Like even stuff like had all these appointments today, had to fit the run or the ride in here, aspects of the day, week, even like weather sometimes. Scott knows this, I used to live out in New England as well too. And so there's a lot of crappy weather there. So if it was a day where I was out there for riding for 3 hours in snow and ice, I'd write it down because that ride got a little impacted from that. So, and then that way, if you look at the entire accumulation after a week or something, especially if you're like, God, I'm hitting all my training numbers, but I feel like crap. A lot of times we can start to pull out other clues and go, oh, actually, I didn't sleep that much this week. Oh, I had more stress at work this week. In order to try and accommodate for that so that we aren't setting ourselves up for injury down the road. So couple takeaways. So injuries are the sequela of instances in which load is more than load tolerance. If we pay attention, a lot of times they can be preventable. Now, we all have hit the trail hard at some point that did not feel like a preventable instant, and that's okay. But the goal with this is, even if we do have a fall or a trip or something that didn't come from just overtraining or whatever else it might be, is that we are as robust as possible to be able to pop back up off that ground as quickly as possible. If we don't have the muscle mass to help support us, the bones also are not as supported. If we don't have the power to be able to get ourselves back up, quite literally, all these things can still contribute to how much we might get injured, even on something like a fall that really isn't preventable. We all hit the ground at some point. It's not if, but when. Like I said, we all have the ability to be robust athletes to help keep injury risk low. And that's really what we're doing, is we're keeping our risks low. Everything's a calculated risk, right? But we want to make sure that we're able to set ourselves up for running as far, as long, and as best as we can. So, and again, I know I keep saying this, factors outside of training contribute to injury risk. So load is not just mechanical in nature. It's emotional in nature. It's neurovascular in nature. It's everything in nature. So make sure you're just paying attention to some things that may not seem like training pertinent at the time. But again, we have one body to do all the things. It does the work. It does the family life. It does the training. It does all the stuff. And so if we are using a lot of those matches in one instance, we have less for another. So I talk fast, guys. So I think that's all I got, basically. Here's some of my contact info. If you do like any of this stuff, or if you're like, hey, strength training, that sounds neat. I post a lot of workouts on Instagram. I'm very available by email. And then if you're looking for exercises too, I've got a ton of stuff on YouTube, and that's my website as well. But I would love to just open it up to some questions if anyone does have any. Let me pause this real quick. But what do you think, Scott? What else do you got?
I think it was great. I'm going to give you hopefully an easy one, and then people can chime in with their questions. But all right, obviously you go for a run, you feel a little something, or you go for a bike ride, you feel a little something. As soon as you get home, you're probably not calling your PT with every little nick that you feel. So when is it a good time to say, hey, I need to get professional intervention? Do you feel like there's a certain time frame of like, hey, like this has been going on for X amount of time? Um, and then a quick follow up to that is you get into PT. How I feel like some PTs, can get a bad rap because some don't do an excellent job like you do. And right, like I know how valuable a PT is because they're going to progressively overload you so that you get better. But maybe give us a few sentences on why a PT is going to be more helpful in your return to sport than maybe doing it on your own.
Awesome. Yeah. So, first part of the question, you're right. Like every little niggling thing doesn't necessarily need to come see me. And quite honestly, one of our jobs as a PT is to make sure we give you guys tools to be able to kind of fix some of this stuff yourself. So, some of my rules of thumb are first off, if you modify, but then it still continues to significantly impact your training or your life. So like if it starts impacting your whatever this pain is, or if you feel it every time you take a step, even when you're just walking, that's our clue to say, hey, maybe something's going on. Especially too, if after you run something lasts longer than 48 hours and then happens every single time after you run, that's when we start to say, okay, we might need a little bit more help outside of that too. And so that's when we do come into focus and when we can be really helpful. Because, like I said, our goal is not only to get you back on the trail or the road as soon as possible, but it's also to give you the tools to be able to fix things on your own if they do happen to go a little sideways. So, again, we talked about how all of us hit the road or hit the ground at some point. The goal is to give you some tools, like, say, you're coming in for back pain. And sometimes if you tweak something when you hit the ground, it might show up just a little bit again. The goal is for you to be able to look at some of the exercises we've done in the past and say, oh, okay, these are the things that I can do to help with this. The second thing for PT, and you guys know who's seen me, I talk a lot about this, is education. Excuse me. So our job is really to educate you on what's going on in your body because we went to school for this. We shouldn't expect you guys to know everything that's going on here. So our goal though is to make sure we can make you understand what might have happened to cause this injury and then how we can make it preventable too. Because I think the more people understand their bodies, the easier it is for them to A, do the exercises because the exercises always suck, and B, be able to understand, okay, sure, I got hurt here, but I know this isn't the new normal. I know I can change from here. I know I can make this better. So I think PT is really helpful to both be able to shine a light and then to also really execute well, right? There's 10 billion exercises on the internet. You can probably figure out how to help your hamstring strain or whatever it might be. But the goal with PT is to really make sure we're making something specific for you for what we see, because there's a billion different reasons that you might have strained your hamstring. Let's make sure we're figuring out so it's really specific for you and really efficient and effective.
Thank you. All
You
right.
bet.
Who else has got a question? We got a few minutes.
Nothing?
I have a question.
Yeah.
On the point about non-training load, like work stress, life stress, family stress, etc., in addition to whatever training you're doing. How do you know that, how do you know that you have reached a kind of critical point of, oh, this is like stress from these situations plus training stress is now at the point where you need to like back off? Like, how do you know that? Because it's not physical. Like, what do you use for judgment there?
That's a great question. Yeah. And sometimes it comes down to kind of listening to your own body and your own mind, which is really hard, right? So, some things as far as like psychologically we're thinking about. So, if sleep changes, so if you're having a harder time falling asleep or having a harder time staying asleep, if appetite changes, so if all of a sudden you're either feeling like you're hungry all the time, even though training hasn't changed, or more often than not, if your appetite totally drops off and you're like, I don't know what's going on. Same thing, and this does come a little bit into training too, but energy. So if you just feel tired all the time, but nothing else has changed, look at some of the other aspects that might not be training load. And then I had another one, I forgot it already. Dang, that's usually how it goes, in and out as fast as possible. So I would say sleep's one of the big ones. Oh, and then looking at how you do feel on the trail or on the road. Because again, if no other factors have changed, say it's even one of your rest weeks and you just have a couple easy runs and you feel like crap, it's good to look and see, okay, what other things might be contributing to this? And again, that's hard to do sometimes, right? Like most of the times when we're stressed, or I should say at least half the time, we don't even realize it, right? And then someone's like, hey, there's a lot of things going on in your life. And you're like, there are a lot of things going on in my life. So it does require some introspection to figure out if it may be something that's not just mechanical or physical in nature. But I think it's honestly a good practice for us in general to be able to listen to both the body and the mind a little bit. And that's not one of the things running's both good for, because it helps us kind of tune into ourselves, but also tough for, because it does make us push through discomfort a lot too. So a lot of times too, if we start to see weeks upon weeks of like just never hitting the goals in the workout or never feeling good, or like I said, big sleep changes. Oh, that was the other thing I was going to say too. Or if you start dreading your workouts, if you start being like, God, I just really don't want to get out today, that's a really good instance of like, okay, maybe there's something else going on that I need to pay attention to in a couple other aspects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
You bet.
Yeah, and I'll chime in here because it's kind of like a head coach question too. Um, I think the other part is like, one, if you're looking for a technological way of measuring this, HRV is great, and like using someone like Marco Altini's platform, HRV for runners, I think is excellent. But then like just getting really simple with this, right? Like if you just use like red, yellow, green, right, and you think of your stress of the day, one day I'm going to say generally means nothing, right? You could have the best day in the world or the worst day in the world, and it kind of means nothing. But if you get a string of, call it 5 red days, then I would say life stress is really high. And then your coach probably isn't going to be able to know that unless you're communicating that. Like we can see the external load by measuring pace or heart rate or whatever, however we want to measure that. But that internal load is something that we can't measure. So I do think like one, you can as an athlete think about, hey, again, use that red, yellow, green. If I'm having 5 red days in a row, like, hey, let's like consider adjusting training, or maybe 3 red days in a row. And then just again, daily comments and training peaks are very helpful for this.
Yeah, that's a super good point, especially about HRV as well too. I like that red, yellow, green. Just make it easy.
Yeah. I think we all know when we're like super stressed, it's hard to admit it, but if you can take that objective step, it can. One question in the chat, and then after this question, I will hold the Run Fasta team for some raffles. But the question in the chat was, if you are in the latter stages of a long race where you feel your gait your gait is changing, is there a quick fix to get you back on track? I'll pass that one to you, to Jessie.
Great question. A little bit tough depending on kind of how your gait is changing. But one thing you can try and do, and again, I know this is tough when you are later in the race, but just increase your turnover rate a little bit. So not speed, do not increase speed, but increase your turnover rate. Less time on the ground, which is what happens when you increase your step rate, decreases injury risk, and it also allows you to kind of get into a little bit more of a flow state too. So again, it's really dependent upon how gait might change, quote unquote, but a really quick one would be to do that. Second quick one would be, honestly, some really big deep breaths in and out. So a lot of times as we start to get more and more fatigued, again, we get this forward lean, our rib cage starts to get less and less expansive. And if we take a couple deep breaths in, it can oftentimes reset the system, remind the trunk how to rotate, and remind the legs how to honestly move a little bit better. So those are kind of the 2 real quick fixes that you can try. You bet, Sheree.
Awesome. Jessie, thank you very much. And I will definitely take a look at her Instagram. I feel like she's got a lot of very helpful things in general there. We'll have Jessie on again, maybe towards the end of the year. Everybody, thank you for coming. If you are on the Run Fasta team, please stay in the chat, and we will do some raffles. I'm going to stop this recording now.